Hey everybody, I'm Michelle. I'm on staff here at City Church, and I am joined today by Chris and Catherine Marlin. And we are here to talk about one of our four values. Our four values at City Church OTR are family, mission, presence, and formation. So right now we're talking about the value of presence. So what does it mean, Chris, when we talk about the value of presence?
I think what it means here, the way that we sort of define it, is I almost get this picture of like, are we interruptible? Can God break in if he wanted to? Like, you can almost program God out of services or groups or whatever. And so I like to think like, God, at any moment, during a service, during a house group, during an event, at any moment, if you have something to say, if you have something you want to do, you have permission. Like, there is a blanket invitation. And I love almost like this idea of childlikeness, of expectant, like, what's God going to do? I never want to show up either at a service or a house group and say, like, I know exactly how this is going to go. I think I want our church to be like, I wonder what he's going to do next. Mm-hmm. Like, almost like a child in a new place. Like, oh man, I wonder what he's going to do. And so I love the idea, those two words we say a lot, of like, we want to be expectant for God to move. And we want to, and I'm very type A, as you know.
I was like, this is a really big learning curve for me of like, oh, we're going to actually leave space to like have the plan go out the window.
Yeah, love a good plan. And as a Christian and as the leader of this church, I want to know like my plan is underneath whatever he wants to do. And so he has permission to interrupt whatever we want. And so I love this idea. I think maybe a big passage that changed this for me is deep in the Old Testament, Exodus 32, 33. And so this is Moses leading the Israelites out of the wilderness into the promised land. And they keep messing up at the point where they like make a golden calf and worship it and all of that. And so God comes to Moses with, I think, what is such an interesting proposal. He comes to Moses and he says, basically two options. You can Exodus 32, he's like, two options. And here's what you should do, Moses. Let's start over. Or actually, I'm going to send ahead of you an angel. You're going to get to the promised land, milk, honey, total success. But I'm a little fed up. And this is a brutally honest passage. God says, God says, like, I'm so over it. Like, I can't even. And as the kids would say. Yeah. And so he says, I don't think I can go with you. But I will promise you success if I'll send my angel, one of my best ones.
Crazy deal.
Or the other option is God says, I'll stay here with you. I don't know if we're going to move yet. I'll stay here with you, but just know that like I might destroy you. And which again, brutally honest. And Moses immediately says, if your presence doesn't go with us, then we won't go. And so I read that and I'm like, what does Moses know that we don't know? Because I think oftentimes I would take guaranteed success, send the angel, milk, honey, all of it. But Moses didn't even flinch. And he's like, no, if your presence doesn't go, I won't go. And so there was something about the presence of God that Moses had tasted that he's like, no, if you're not here, I don't want any part of it. Because he knew God's presence changes everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for both of us, kind of a window into our lives, like our upbringings were amazing with faith. They were a bit more traditional. And so being with God changes everything. That phrase, it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, that's new.
Especially when we lived in Vegas, like we experienced God in crazy ways. But in particular, like we walked through a season of infertility, and it was moments where God like broke in, spoke to us, like just in our thoughts, like some word of encouragement or someone speaking something over us that they felt like they heard from the Lord. Where it just changed everything for us. It changed our perspective. It made that season actually like a beautiful season because we were with God in the midst of it and we truly like felt his presence.
Yeah.
So one of the things we hear actually pretty often from people who are part of our community is the way that they like experience the presence of God, either on Sundays or in house groups. Like we hear that pretty often.
Yeah.
Which you would hope or kind of expect for like a church that that's a normal thing. Like we would expect the presence of God to show up. But I don't think that actually is true. Like I think the reality is it's not a guarantee or it's not an assumption we can make. But I think there's something happening here where the Lord's showing up.
Yeah.
A lot.
And every time I'm like so humbled by it, like that he does. He comes here and I mean, you've gotten a window into like planning a service or leading a house group. And it's actually easier. I mean, it's almost easier to do it and just plan it as if he won't show up or if nothing will change. Because at least with the plan, we can,
I can execute a plan. We got I got a plan.
Yeah.
And so, and I understand, and I think at moments been tempted to like do church, in some ways, do church without God. Because it's possible, it's feasible, it works at a certain level. And so it's possible to do church without God. And also, we don't want to. Or that just feels like a waste of time. Like if we're gathering, but he's not here, then we might as well be the Rotary Club or some, and the Rotary Club's great, but that's not what we're after. That's not what we want to do. And so I know for us, like in both of our front doors, the Sunday morning and the house group, we say at any moment, God can interrupt. And we tell, like it's a requirement of our house group leaders, when you lead, there's a couple things you have to do. You have to eat together. We want you to like be focused on life change. But one of the things we say is there should always be a moment that you plan in there where if God wants to interrupt, he can. This isn't like pray before a meal. It's like there should be a moment where you're listening. And I know I'm doing most of the talking, but like how boring of a podcast if this conversation was only one of us talking.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, like if we're going to have a relationship with God, there should be a moment where we're talking. That's prayer to him. And there should be a moment where like, God, what are you saying? Or is there anything that you want to change about this right now? Yeah.
And I mean, people are experiencing this in our service. I think of Abigail recently. She, during the sermon, and you weren't even preaching about salvation that day.
Probably
or
wasn't
like
even good.
A gospel message or anything. But God spoke to her. She felt like he was calling her back home. She had been running away from him and just like, trying to do her own thing. And she felt like God was truly calling her back home. So she felt that during the message. And then during worship, we were singing a song about God's goodness running after us. And she's a mess because it's like, wow, God is truly here. So we've created this environment where we are inviting God into our space and knowing and expecting that he will show up because he loves to be with his people.
And that idea of like being with God changes everything. I mean, for Abigail, she's part of our prayer team. She's a great leader in our community. Just, she's awesome. And just seeing even the way that her experience with the Lord has just lit a fire that she's running with, which is awesome.
And if he wasn't here, then that would not have happened. It wasn't the sermon. It wasn't even like the worship. It was the fact that he was here and that changed everything for her. And so I know we're sold on it. It's choosing the harder, maybe more complex thing, but we want him to be here because, and there's studies that, Barna and different people are doing that are saying this generation, if we're talking about primarily millennials, Gen Z, this generation isn't so much anymore. And this is not a bad strategy. It's just not ours. They're not looking for a show anymore or a place that they can just go and like try to be anonymous, like sometimes. But what primarily the younger generations are asking are two big things. Like, is God there? Like, if you say that this is the house of God, is God home? And are his people for real? And we know that hypocritical behavior is probably the biggest reason that people are leaving the church. And so that is on us. Even the family podcast we talked about of how we want to be real and authentic. So some of that is on us. Like, can we be real people that we can talk about sports and about the Bible? Can we talk about cooking? And can we pray for each other? But the other piece of that, and the primary piece, is if I'm going to go spend my Sunday morning not at brunch or not sleeping in, I want to know he's there. Like, I believe he's real, but he hasn't seemed relevant in my life. Is God there? And so this generation, I think, is asking that big question. And so we want to create a space where there's an answer for that. Like, he's here. His people are real. We're not perfect, but there's at least a God who's like showing up every Sunday morning or every Wednesday night in our group, every Tuesday night in that group. And I think that's a big piece of why we're seeing stories like Abigail happen.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so cool to see the way that God's showing up and that he's moving here. It's incredible. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you guys. Thank you all for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you on our next episode.